Hello and welcome to the Eco-Modernist Channel Live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm joined by Gabriel Ignetti, Christopher Bergen, Tim Larson, and of course, our guest, Dr. Wade Allison, who is an emeritus professor of physics at Oxford University, the author of many books, including Nuclear is for Life, A Cultural Revolution, and Radiation and Reason, The Impact of Science on a Culture of Fear. This book has attracted considerable attention worldwide. Dr. Allison, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Although I'm not here, I'm miles away. I'm sitting just outside Oxford. Really, I want to go back in time. I want to go back, right the way back to about 3,000 million years ago, when life started on Earth. And to do anything at all, it needed energy. So energy has always been the basic need of life. Skipping forward a bit, but as soon as vegetable life got going, it took its energy from the sun every day in the summer, and packed up its bags in the winter and left a few seeds or something and had another go next time around in the summer. But it was pretty awful, and it frequently failed altogether and died out. But some of it got laid down as coal and oil in the process. And then something extraordinary happened. And of course, I don't know quite when and exactly how this happened. But then animal life came. And that had the fantastic idea of actually carrying your energy round with you. It's called food. And you need a fairly complex internal combustion engine called a heart and a digestive system in order to use this food. Of course, that went on for a long time. And then about 600,000 years ago, there was a really highly disruptive event in which some life that thought it knew what it was doing appeared, and that was mankind. And because we learnt, first of all, to think, or some of us did anyway, and talk to one another and communicate and teach our children. And with this education, somebody once said to his wife, "I'm going to bring some fire into the home." And she said, "You're stark staring mad. You're not going to do that. Otherwise, I'm going and I'm going to take the children with me." Well, luckily, this green movement 600,000 years ago did not succeed. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today, because we learnt to use fire and the wind and the sun and to use our sense and to calm the elements around us. What we would call renewables today. The things that are powered basically by the sun. And so humans became the dominant animals on the planet. And that was pretty good, at least a hell of a lot better than for the other animals. But life was pretty awful, because we learnt to speak to one another and organize one another. One of the things you could do was organize teams of animals and teams of humans, otherwise known as slaves, to do what you want. And so slavery was born, because there wasn't enough energy to run the world as we needed to run it without slavery. Because when the wind didn't blow, you needed the galley slaves to propel the galley through the water. So that was pretty awful. And life expectancy was half, and it was miserable. And then in the 16th, 17th century, fossil fuels and the technology of the steam engine, the energy density, the amount of energy available per kilogram went up by a factor of about 10,000. Secondly, you could store it. So we could have secure energy 24/7. And my goodness, did things get better. And we could suddenly say that slavery was a bad thing and outlaw it and so on. But that was only because we could, because we had enough energy to be able to say we didn't want any slavery. So you can run the sugar plantations and so on with tractors and mechanical devices. So suddenly life got a hell of a lot better. And civilization, as we knew it, flowered. But we've suddenly realized that although fire is quite dangerous, but it could at least be tamed to a degree, it had this accumulative effect on the environment, both as far as pollution and probably climate change. Although I don't think anybody could honestly say they understand the extent to which we are threatened by climate change. I don't. But it is a serious problem whose bounds we don't know. And by the time we do know, it'll be too late to do anything about it. So better take it seriously. I mean, when I go out in my car, I take out insurance. It doesn't mean to say I know that I'm going to hit somebody, but I might. So doing something about climate change is an insurance policy. It doesn't mean to say that we can prove it or disprove it, in particular because it's not really the atmosphere that is the main problem. It's the oceans. The oceans are, I think it's about 7 times the mass of the atmosphere. So what is building up in the oceans is 7 times more important than what is building up in the atmosphere. People don't say that enough. So we've got to a new critical point in this development of life and energy, and that's where we are now. Meanwhile, we understood the physics of what was going on with these fossil fuels. And basically we understood chemistry. Well, calling it chemistry happened fairly early on, but what the hell was actually happening? Because you can't see any wheels or springs or anything in chemistry. You look at a lump of coal, it's not obvious where the energy is stored. And it wasn't until the 1920s, with the understanding of quantum mechanics, that we really understood is due to the movement of electrons inside atoms by wave mechanics. It's not very complicated. You can write it down in a couple of lines. And when I'm telling kids in schools, 15, 16, 17, I go into details, but I won't try to do that online. So we learnt that it's electrons inside atoms, and that is responsible for all of batteries and chemistry and food and oil and gas and lasers and almost everything we see around us that we regard as modern. But exactly the same argument, it's not complicated, exactly the same argument applied to the other part of the atom, which is the nucleus. And in the nucleus, it's 100,000 times smaller. And because it's 100,000 times smaller, the protons and neutrons inside a nucleus have over 1 million times as much energy as electrons in atoms. And understanding that was, I say, was obvious from the 1920s. And it's interesting, some people, not many of them, some people understood or at least read about it carefully. One of those was Winston Churchill, who wrote in 1931 that the amount of energy available from nuclear energy was 1 million times what you could get from coal. And that factor is more or less exactly correct. There's nothing woolly about it. There's nothing hand-waving. It's nothing to do with technology. Technology is what man does with the world that we find. I'm talking about nature, the world that before we start messing about with it as we do. So nuclear energy was 1,000,000 times more. And then, of course, we've got the technology of how to do it. Now, admittedly, in 1931, nobody knew how to get the energy out and control it. And it wasn't until the work of Lise Meitner, an Austrian physicist who unfortunately was Jewish, working in Berlin in 1938. And being Jewish in Berlin in 1938 was a pretty dangerous activity. And she was very frightened of what she has discovered, and so was her nephew, who taught me nuclear physics at Cambridge. And she and her nephew escaped to Sweden in 1938. And actually, this last weekend, I went to a little village in the UK with my sister. We're trying to find Lise Meitner's grave. So she and her nephew ended up in England. And it was she who learnt about nuclear fission with thermal neutrons. So Churchill was right that the energy was there. He was also right to say that this enormous factor of 1,000,000 would have a massively bigger effect on human civilization than the use of fossil fuels and steam engines did at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so it's the realization of putting these ideas into practice that we're talking about. Now, all was going quite well. In fact, all was going very well, particularly in medicine, because back at the end of the 19th century, when Marie Curie and Becquerel and others discovered nuclear energy, nuclear decay, and they learnt to use it for medicine, and people now are used to receiving relatively huge amounts of radiation for their own health, and it's very carefully controlled, and their hair may fall out and so on, but they say thank you to their doctor, and they go home and they live another 5 to 10 years of their life having had cancer cured. And this is the kind of thing that people have got to realize, how beneficial nuclear energy can be. But meanwhile, something dreadful happened. And what happened really was Lise Meitner and physicists of the day realized that this huge amount of energy could be used for military purposes. And it scared the daylights out of them. And the amount of energy frightened them. And then they did not trust the military and the politicians to behave sensibly with it. So after the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we know now that a rather small number, like 0.5% of those who died of cancer in the following 60 years as a result of those bombs. Most of the people who died from the fire and blast, just as they do with bombing, whether it's in Tokyo or in Berlin or Hamburg or today in Chechnya or other places. Evil men will find energy and misuse it, and it doesn't have to be nuclear. They'll do it anyway, as we see, unfortunately, in Ukraine today. So nuclear is not more evil than chemical explosives, just bigger, that's all. And then all was going on quite well until after the war, after 1945, there was the arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. And they were both building more and more nuclear weapons. And people got frightened, not so much of the nuclear weapons themselves, but of the responsibility of the people who had control of them. And so a number of Nobel Prize winners wrote and protested against nuclear weapons. And how did this stop? Well, it stopped by exaggerating the effect of the radiation. And in fact, back in Marie Curie's day, there were some accidents with radiation. People who painted fluorescent things on dials and things. In 1934, there was an international agreement by the International Commission for Radiological Protection, the same body that causes trouble today. There was international agreement on what was a safe level. And there's nothing that has happened since 1934 to suggest that their numbers were wrong. On the other hand, in order to suppress the effect of the arms race, to frighten people, they exaggerated the size of what is a safe exposure to radiation by, well, my figure was 1,000 times. Actually, the 1934 figure represents about 600 times, but I'm not talking about factors of 2 anyway, so don't really worry about that. And so in 1955, people were, by that time, had become very worried. In fact, in 1954, at the age of 13, I was on holiday with my parents in France, and my sister and I got very ill, and they took us to Geneva. And we went into Geneva when we got better, and there was a big exhibition on, which was Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace exhibition. And that was why I got involved in science. And I went back to school and said, I'm going to specialize in science. It's funny how these things happen. They go round, but that's outreach for you. But at the same time, in 1954 and 1955, in the States, there's the era of Joseph McCarthy. Now, I don't know how many of you lived through a period of the fear of un-American activities, and people were incarcerated and so on because they were Russian spies and so on. I mean, the degree of mistrust, we've got to learn to trust one another and trust science. When I went to Fukushima, I didn't see anything that surprised me, but was horrified at the degree of distrust between the Japanese people and the authorities. And the reason is that, in fact, the Japanese people didn't know anything about nuclear, and neither did the authorities. So they all distrusted one another, they distrusted science, so they turned all their nuclear power stations off, and the result was terrible for the environment. So trust is what we're trying to get to. If we can trust, we can have as much energy as we want. As a result of the Joseph McCarthy era, the level of acceptable radiation went up and up by a factor of 1,000. And because nobody knew enough, everybody referred up to your next level of management. So every country thought, we don't know enough about radiation, we'll go up to the United Nations. Now, the most serious form of radiation damage for most people is what you can get from an overexposure to sunshine with ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And that's far worse than anything they'd ever get from nuclear radiation. And we don't allow the United Nations to take charge of sunbathing regime when we go on holiday, which would be much more sensible they did. So there are so many committees of the United Nations or national committees and so on. They're all warring with one another for resources and territory and empire. And we don't need all these committees. We need World Health Organization. We need a IAEA who have some responsibility for nuclear resources amongst nations. But even that gets overdone. But There are far too many people whose reputations depend on this fear of nuclear radiation. And there's a lovely quote which I put in my book, and it is that it's difficult to persuade somebody if their salary depends on them not understanding it. And I think that is so clear. People find their job is much more important than their understanding. And that causes us great difficulties. So where's it all gone wrong? Well, it's gone wrong because we have compartmentalized education systems and compartmentalized responsibilities. And it's only old codgers like me who can talk about physics and biology and resources. And the biggest mistake that we have made is compartmentalizing our understanding of the world we live in, and then not allowing ourselves to teach and to talk about and see how wrong everything is. So we are in the same situation as the motor cars were in about 1900. In about 1900, all the good ladies in the Western world were terrified that they were going to have steam engines, and they thought of trains running on the road, and not only frightening the horses as they saw it, but splashing mud also, and extremely dangerous. And steam trains were pretty dangerous in those days. There were some pretty horrific accidents on the railways. But to put them on the road, my goodness, no. So they all voted against it. Finally, the diesel engine and the petrol engine in France and Germany, and the building of small cars, not big steam engines, that made, in fact, so they withdrew the legislation which says you had to have somebody with a red flag walking in front of your car, and they allowed the traffic to go at a higher speed. Not at a speed which is so slow that nobody ever gets damaged by traffic, because it still happens. But where it doesn't happen that often, it's a balance of judgment. That balance of judgment has never been applied to nuclear. We need a balance of judgment, and we have to realize that, in fact, at Chernobyl, 35 or odd people were killed, and that was a very bad accident. Fukushima is called a disaster. It wasn't a disaster at all. Not a single person died of radiation. One person got legal compensation for getting cancer after, as a result of having received radiation and getting cancer, but there's no connection between the two. And a lot of people died because they were moved out of old people's homes and put into buses and taken to other unfamiliar places. Same thing happened at Chernobyl, in fact. But now it's like 1900 with cars, and there are hundreds of different designs of small nuclear power plants, not these huge, big, pressurized water ones that were being built up till now, but little ones which are suitable for providing all the needs for 100,000 people or so. No need for massive grids of electric grids or anything. No need for undersea cables which Putin can come and bomb. Just small, compact, local things that people can trust, where the kids go round the installation from their school, where you know somebody who works there, and anyway, it's only 50 miles from where you live. This is the kind of way eco-modernism should be thinking of building viable small units. And to go even further ahead, 200 years from now, vertical farming. Well, so far it's only vegetables and fruit, but I can go much further than that later on. Indoors, not using sunlight at all, not using heat from the sun at all, but using surplus heat from nuclear power stations and LEDs, and where you can grow strawberries and raspberries all year round at the North Pole. And you're completely divorced from the seasons, you're completely divorced from the variability of the weather, and this will be local, it will be secure, and people can have what they want. So no food miles, no fuel miles. But that's a long way done. And then, of course, the rest of nature can at last be let loose and be a source of enjoyment for humans and the other creatures on this earth. And that is what I think, the direction that I think eco-modernism should be going into. Thank you.
So thank you again for being here, and let me open it up to the floor for questions.
What was it like to live through Aberfan and the disaster there?
Oh, I mean, I think that is the kind of learning experience which is extremely important for civilization. Yes, that was terrible. I mean, my wife is Welsh. She had family that were not far away. So I think we've got to learn from those sort of things all the time. And there were accidents with radiation, with the girls who used to paint with radioactive paint on dials and so on. And a lot was learned from that. Yes, I think things like Aberfan and the radium girls and so on, it's very important that we watch out for those sort of things. But the precautionary principle, where you run away from things before you found out about them, is no good.
In fact, we had a repeat of Aberfan in the modern era in Kingston, Tennessee. And so there is a enormous patch of land near a coal plant. And hopefully, when that coal plant is converted into a nuclear plant, those will be a place where homes can be, or perhaps they'll continue to remediate the soil. This question, this is from a quote read by the fantastic actor, I believe it was Jared Harris, who played one of the characters, Legasov, in HBO's Chernobyl. Every atom of uranium is like a bullet, penetrating everything in its path. Metal, concrete, flesh. Chernobyl holds over 3 trillion of those bullets. Some of them will not stop firing for 50,000 years. So my question about this quote, how is radiation like a gunshot, and how is it different?
Well, the first thing is that radiation has been around the universe long before we got involved. In fact, back at the evolution of vegetable life, biology had to learn to cope with the effects of radiation on life. If it hadn't succeeded in doing that, we wouldn't have been here. In fact, the vegetable life wouldn't have been here either. And so if you use it in medicine to knock out a tumor and kill the cells of a tumor, that's exactly what happens. But the point is, you have to raise the number of gunshots so high that you're way higher than anything except the very small number of people who were killed at Chernobyl, and far higher than anybody who was affected at Fukushima.
If you look deeply enough at people's reservations about nuclear energy, it always seems to come down to a fundamental misunderstanding of radiation, is how I've begun to see it. They equate millions of years of radioactivity as just as dangerous as being in the reactor or just after it's taken out of the reactor, and nothing could be further than the truth. So I wonder if you could just mention something about that.
Well, the number of atoms that go bang in your body per second is about 7,000 in everybody's body. And it's always been like that. So people want to run away from radiation, they can't do it. And in fact, experiments have been done in which the radiation is completely removed from body, and biology doesn't like it because it's removed. In fact, radiation is rather like running a exercise. The body is used to protect against radiation and against oxygen. It needs to have exercise. Now we're used to this as for physical exercise. I mean, I like to tell the story of a fictional story of a physicist who prepares to run a marathon, and he goes to bed for a month before the marathon, and he eats exactly the right food to build himself up, so he's got all the energy in his body ready for the marathon. Whereas, of course, the effective thing is to go and do exercise every day and to build up and to damage your body every day, and the body gets used to being damaged. And then when you come and run a full marathon for the first time, you will survive it. Whereas the biologists who run a marathon might win but the physicist, I would suggest, will fall over in a heap long before he gets to the end of the marathon. So biology and physics are not the same sort of thing. In fact, the big thing is that we should be changing our education. We should not be not allowing physicists not to learn about biology. Economists should be learning about physics. Our education is too compartmentalized, and I think this is a problem around the world, certainly true in the UK. And we should have enough energy and enough resources that we can spare the extra effort to have more teaching, more learning, and less repetitive jobs in your eco-modernist world. So there should be a lot more education, a lot more looking after old people. Well, you would expect me to say that at my age, wouldn't you? But looking after children, looking after education, and education should be through life. But the trouble is, education, we get terribly set in the way we think by the age of 10, 15, 20. We stop changing the way we think. And it's the way that different subjects think which is important.
I absolutely appreciate the education, and let me give a quick shout out to my channel and everyone out there. I was the opening speaker at Thorium Energy Alliance conference, and I had a fantastic science education. I had a father working tangential to nuclear energy and in nuclear energy for a while, and I did not learn a thing about radiation. I learned that radiation was bad and nuclear waste had to be put inside hot cells and big massive tanks because of radiation, and that was it. That was the end of my radiation education. It's absolutely essential, I think, that we teach people that the longer the half-life, the less dangerous the isotope is. This is like a fundamental elementary school fact that everyone could be taught, and we could all know it.
The most dangerous things are chemicals. Right? Arsenic. Right. Arsenic, cadmium. They don't die away at all. They last forever. And the most dangerous things are human waste, of which we produce 2 kilograms a day each throughout our lives. Yeah. It's so dangerous that it's mishandled. It kills millions of people in underdeveloped countries a year. It's so dangerous that we teach children from the age of about 18 months to 2 years to start to learn to look after their biological waste. We don't teach anybody about nuclear waste. If you go to Japan, everybody in Japan learns about tsunamis and earthquakes in school. They have practices. And when there's an earthquake or a tsunami, they hide under the table, they put on their hard hats. They know what to do. Society knows how to respond. When they're hit with a nuclear accident, they don't know what to do. Nobody tells them. Nobody's hurt, but they're terrified even till 20 years later.
I might add that people died in approved tsunami shelters in Japan. It was just tsunamis are very fickle, and there were places that had never seen a tsunami before that were inundated, and a river was flooded 10 miles upstream. They're weird, dangerous, nasty things.
Great comment. So just to tie up this question, the difference between radiation and arsenic is that we know what to do with arsenic after it's time to dispose of it. We put it in a geological repository. Germany has many of these. They're well managed, but somehow Germany has managed to screw up all of their radiation isolated repositories, and now they're terrified of it.
It's important to point out how much normal human psychology creates a feedback loop, okay? And you see this in every disaster, not just radiation. The first thing the authorities do when they show up is they tell everyone, stay in your home, be calm, do this, do that. And the first thing everyone assumes is that they're being lied to, okay? Because we have, as humans, we have this instinct. We want to help out. We want to take some sort of action, okay? Either build a defense or run away or assist whoever's doing the cleanup, whatever it is. But actually with radiation, the very, 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 very best thing you can do is just lock your door and maybe put a towel under the window, okay? The radionuclides are not going to chase you. So, the authorities show up and they say, okay, everyone, there's been a radiation accident, everyone stay in your home. And all the paranoia, it just creates this perfectly ripe ground for all of the paranoia, all of the conspiracy theories.
I agree with you. But the problem is when the authorities don't know what to do, and they can't do nothing. So the authorities, they have to do something, and what they do may be counterproductive. So, for instance, at Fukushima, the authorities moved all of the people in old people's homes. They moved them out of where the tsunami had been, right into the middle of where the radiation was, because the radiation was blown inland and the tsunami's on the shore. So there were a lot of people who were evacuated into the region, which just hours later they decided was the most dangerous radiation place. So there was panic. And of course, panic is what they're trying to avoid.
There's also a lot of special cases with Fukushima as opposed to most other radiation accidents. Old people are not susceptible because they have fewer cell divisions, or are just not susceptible to the same radiation hazards. But Japan prioritized evacuating them when you didn't need to do anything. But they just wanted to look like they were caring. It's more of this, security theater. And
the vast majority of those people froze to death on those buses when they were abandoned in traffic.
Yeah, it was terrible. Yeah, they were killed by their nutty government. But the other,
Greg Jasko.
What was I going to say? Yeah, and Jasko.
Jasko, the most unhelpful contribution from the United States.
Now I remember there was there's a very interesting radiation factoid that's unique to the Japanese population cohort. Is we all know that iodine is the only radionuclide that deserves, iodine 131 is the only radionuclide that deserves serious concern. All the rest are
cesium 137, but on a different time scale.
Well, cesium and strontium are only mentioned. I mean, they can be hazards, but they're really only mentioned because people don't want to admit that there's only one serious problem. Then all the rest are almost completely irrelevant. So you got those top three, and iodine's the really bad one.
It gets concentrated.
Yeah, that's what I want to touch on. What's interesting about the Japanese people is almost everyone in Japan naturally already has a fully saturated thyroid gland. They don't need to take iodine pills.
They eat seaweed,
Yes,
which
exactly.
is the most iodine-rich food you can have. Whereas
Yeah,
the people in Chernobyl did not eat seaweed.
No matter what level of detail you look at it, the Japanese were just jumping at phantoms.
Yeah, but they didn't have to import Mr. Jatko from the United States to make them jump.
The people who helped shut down Indian Point in New York State are called river keepers. They
Right.
stand to make some millions of dollars for doing that. And now the people in Florida, Miami, Turkey Point nuclear reactor, they're called water keepers because apparently it's not quite a river. The whole segment on our national news was about how dangerous the waste was. And it was just, wow, really, really, really bad. And Jasko had a starring role.
Where do we take humanity now in order to survive to the next 200 years, to that great eco-modernist future with high energy availability and vertical farming? And you started by giving us education.
The children.
Yes.
The children. Let's start with the children. You can write people like me off. I'm not going to be here. But it's the children we've got to get to.
What is the message for hope? Because, of course, we had COP26 that was declared a failure before it began. So now we have COP27 coming in Egypt, and we're absolutely going to have a nuclear presence. What are we going to do that's going to accomplish something?
We've got to persuade everybody that renewables are not going to do the job. But equally, nuclear is not ready to do the job. We've got a generation of education to do and a generation of building nuclear reactors. And we need tens of thousands of nuclear reactors because by 2050, there should be no renewables as the primary source of energy and no fossil fuels as the primary source of energy. So everything should depend on nuclear.
But let me break this down. If we can get governments to commit to 25%, because tens of thousands, that sounds like a 100% target, which will be...
Yes, that's right.
It will be very challenging to implement.
Politicians look 5 years ahead.
Right.
That's completely irrelevant. We're looking at a problem of hundreds of years. That's the problem. Our politicians are thinking short term. What can they get in? What can they get in their time span before they've got to be re-elected? And what we have to do is not on that time span at all. Mm-hmm. Educating kids is a 20-year job, and rolling out large numbers of small modular reactors, uranium, thorium, all kinds, is another 20-year job.
So the position that I like to forward is today, everyone that you can get to accept it, we should try to get to accept 25% nuclear as the target. And we can say, well, you can try with the rest. You can try to build out solar and wind to fill the rest of our energy demand.
And the fossil fuels will be right in behind you and applauding what you say. Mm-hmm. No, what we have to do is to have several thousand people who know how to build a nuclear reactor. It's not like the rare earth elements that have to go into a wind turbine or the fancy chemicals that have to go into a massive battery, which is not going to work either. A nuclear power plant is mainly steel and concrete and water and a bit of lead and cadmium. It doesn't need the resources that most of these other things need.
I hope we can do it. I hope that we can get there, that we can get to a high energy wealth future by 2050. I'm admitting that we are walking down the path of this controlled opposition between fossil fuels and 100% renewables, and that is the recipe for disaster.
On a 30-year timescale. But yeah, tomorrow we're going to need gas.
Yeah.
And gas is probably the least harmful of the short-term things.
I'm noticing, and part of it is anecdotal, but part of it is also listening to politicians, that the small modular reactors and the advanced reactors, people seem to trust them a lot more than the old style reactors. So, and
well, we're winning. We're beginning to win.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I don't know which of these reactor designs is going to be the Model T Ford. Who knows? I think we've got to learn something from COVID, and that is that the capitalist system was brilliant at coming up with the design, with the vaccines, but distributing them out to the rest of the world and delivering it was rubbish. When we get these Model T Fords going, we've got to give them away. If the world is really threatened by the use of fossil fuels, then it is in our interest to spread their use. So I went out to Indonesia, and Indonesia said, what should we do? And I said, what you've got to do is educate yourselves so that when somebody comes along and offers you a small modular reactor, maybe it's a Thorcon, anyway, there are lots of possibilities. You have got the skills locally in the third world. We've got to give things away in our own interest. And that's going to be very hard. And it was very hard with COVID.
If nuclear power had a tenth of the financial handouts and financing arrangements that renewables get, this would already be solved.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we're going to leave the closing comments to Dr. Allison. What are your closing remarks, Dr. Allison?
One thing that I have learned in the last 2 years, that 70% of the world is covered by sea. And the provision of nuclear power at sea is culturally much easier than providing things on land where you run into all sorts of local opposition. And the provision of nuclear-powered shipping and nuclear-powered sources of energy, which you can float from one place to another or can drive ships and so on, that's a much easier target. And in fact, there is some United Nations guidance on provision of nuclear ships, which has never been enacted by any country in the world. And it's out of date because it dates from the 1980s, but it's going to be implemented and be on the legal books in the UK in November of this year. So it's happening. So don't forget the sea. There's an awful lot of it, and there's an awful lot of pollution is in fact created at sea. And this is low-hanging fruit for the nuclear industry too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention. And let's close this out. Tim, you have some words?
Well, Dr. Allison, we close these podcasts out with a little saying that we have, and that is, emissions first. Peace and justice will follow.
Thank you all. Again, thanks so much for your time and attention, everyone.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Eco-Modern Channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Eco-Modern Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.